Actually, I think it's a nice setting to discuss Russian issues because I quite agree that there are a lot of similarities. And actually, when I was listening to the last presentation, I thought that, well, in a way, it makes my life easier in terms of presenting the Russian case, strange as it may sound. Let me just start by clarifying a couple of things. We are presented on the program by our passports, and I think it makes sense, at least because most of us study the countries we're nationals of, but I've been for 4 years already based in Tartu, so in that respect, of course, I don't represent Russia in any capacity here, except for my expertise. What I will try to do in my presentation is to discuss Russia as a case of peripheral development, and resource dependence, of course, is a huge aspect of that. So I will offer a macro-historical perspective in one sense, but then I will also try to bring it to the present moment and look at the current developments, not just economic, but also political. And I probably should not claim too much expertise on economic issues anyway, being a political scientist and an international relations scholar. And I largely rely on several related theories or schools of thought, such as neo-Marxism, in particular the theory of uneven and combined development, but also world systems theory and post-colonial theory. But I don't really identify myself with any of these literatures. What I'm trying to do in my current research is probably to try to put them in dialogue or in debate with each other and see what comes out of it. So what I am presenting, in a way, is a result of such combination, and also my attempt to put this in the context of constructivist studies on Russian identity and memory politics and similar issues. So Russia, of course, in the context of this panel, presents a clear puzzle, if you want, because the GDP per capita in Russia has grown significantly over the last 15 years, but at the same time, in terms of, for instance, if we look at the world survey data, world value survey data, and other indicators, we will see that Russia has become, if anything, much more conservative in terms of its values, probably remained more or less in the same position on the survival versus self-expression axis. And the political developments, well, I don't have to say anything about this. I think we all know what's going on in the country. It seems that in the Russian case, at least in the short term, economic development doesn't bring about democracy. And I would argue that this is not accidental, at least in the Russian case, because Russia clearly is a case of peripheral development, resource-dependent development, and as such, in this particular case at least, and I suspect in many others as well all over the world, economic development is really not conducive to democratic reform. Let me try to put it in a historical perspective first, or in a retrospective rather. And this is where I think theory of uneven and combined development is extremely useful. And the advantage of this theory is that it looks at the world as an integrated whole, as a capitalist development, as a single world process. And at the same time, it emphasizes the fact that different countries joined this system at different moments and in different capacities. So in the Russian case, we obviously see a country which joined capitalist system, well, you may say relatively early, but at the same time, already as a latecomer. It became more or less fully integrated into Eurocentric capitalist system by 16th century already, and in the capacity of raw material supplier. At that time, it was mostly grain, but also furs, of course, and other commodities. Oil and gas came into the picture, large-scale oil and gas, only in the mid-20th century. Grain was actually the main product that shaped Russia over the centuries. Russia was basically supplying grain to Western Europe, in particular to England, which industrialized already or was in the early stage of industrialization, and needed raw materials, and in particular food. And in that role, Russia's role was absolutely equivalent to England's North American colonies, which also supplied mostly food to the metropole. And as such, as a peripheral country, Russia, the only exception or the only specialty about Russia, which I think is really very important to appreciate, was that Russia remained a sovereign entity throughout its modern history. So it was never colonized politically. It was only, in a way, colonized economically. But a more correct description, in my view, is to say that Russia actually colonized itself, or colonized its own territory on behalf of the global capitalist core. This is what actually happened in the Russian history. So the Russian Empire actually colonized its own periphery, expanded into its own backyard, included its own backyard into the global capitalist system, and in doing that, it actually shaped itself, or was shaped by these developments. One aspect of this development, which is relatively well known, there is a lot of literature on that, including the literature which puts the recent Russian reforms into this context, was that for resource-oriented development, what you need is control over territories. So this is how a strong territorially oriented state emerges in Russia. This was helped, of course, by other aspects of Russia's development, such as feeling vulnerable to various invaders. But this was probably not, the latter was probably not the key element of this development. In general, what was essential is exactly this combination of a very strong state, which tried by all means to control resources and rents from these resources. And as a result, the entire pattern of economic development becomes state-oriented, since the state controls more or less the most important inputs and outputs. Businesses become oriented towards somehow cooperating with, aligning with, serving the state. And you can clearly see this in Russia's early industrialization, for instance, in the 19th century, when all the major enterprises, or even in the 18th century, you may start it with Peter the Great. I mean, all the major enterprises are oriented towards the state. Military industry becomes extremely important and plays very central role, and so on. Over Russia's history, this has manifested itself in various social, legal phenomena, such as serfdom, for instance. And territoriality becomes very important for Russia's identity. You can actually see it. I think it's one of the factors behind the Crimean annexation, because territory is still considered as a resource, and there is a lot of talk about Crimea as a resource today in Russia. You can also discuss, contemporary investment legislation in Russia, the turn which occurred around 2005, away from the more liberal investment regime and towards state protectionism in relation to the so-called strategic sectors. This is also a manifestation of exactly the same phenomenon, I think. But also what is interesting about the Russian model of development and the Russian state as such is the state-society relations, speaking more widely. It is definitely a paternalistic state and a paternalistic system as such, and this is also related to the dominant state, the dominant role of the state in the economy and control over resources and rents. But I think what is also underestimated in the current literature, and this is where the dialogue between different literatures actually helps to appreciate the profoundness of this phenomenon of Russia's self-colonization, is the fact that actually the Russian elites, already by the end of the 18th century, have fully internalized the Eurocentric view, which was in a way, if you want, it was imposed on them by this model of uneven and combined development, or you can say simply that they were Europeanized, depending on which perspective you prefer. But in any case, this Eurocentric perspective was already fully internalized, but the country itself was still in a different mode of functioning, in a different different type of socium was developing there. So this is where we start to see, especially from the 19th century, early 19th century, this huge alienation between the elites and the masses. Pushkin, the quintessential Russian poet, is probably the best illustration of that when he says that the government is the only European in Russia, and mentions the famous phrase about the Russian riot, senseless and merciless. This feeling of fear in the face of one's own people, in the face of the crowd, is actually very pervasive in the Russian literature and also in the political discourse, starting from at least the 19th century, starting from Pushkin and then going on through the Slavophile Westernizers debate and so on. And I think that exactly this phenomenon of subaltern empire, which Russia became in the course of its modern development, actually helps to understand how this came about. So again, the elites were Europeanized; they adopted the Eurocentric perspective, and they basically were the representatives of the colonial powers in their relations with their own people. They colonized or exercised the colonization of the Russian space on behalf of the European core, or Western core by that time, you might say. And there was always this in-between position, and in principle it might have ended well. Or, I don't know, depending on your perspective again. Most Russians certainly would not agree with me. But it might have ended by the elites simply continuing to internalize European values and then educating the masses, and finally the country becoming just part of the core, maybe peripheral part of the core with its own periphery. But then, you know, it's normal situation. Any country has its own periphery. Britain, United States, the most central countries, they all have class problems, center-periphery problems, problems with regional development, more recent problems such as immigration and so on, which is also, of course, some sort of an offshoot of the global uneven development and colonialism and so on. But Russia remained an empire, and it never was fully integrated into the Eurocentric system. It remained an independent sovereign empire which played a very important role in European international politics. So there was this peculiar combination of, on the one hand, Eurocentric perspective that the elites adopted, and on the other hand, rather independent standing that the country had in international affairs, which of course produced the sense of national pride and the desire to perform and to expand and to kind of project power and achieve glory and so on. Why do I think it's a problem, and how I think it works? Okay, sorry. Let me start from the other end, rather. First of all, I should probably emphasize how profound this Europeanization is in the Russian case. You may say, well, come on, Russia right now is promoting traditional values, saying that it's not European at all, that it's very different, that this is a country which has its own values, its own agenda, and so on. Well, look at what this agenda is. First of all, it's mostly negative. It's about repressing the bad guys. It's not about promoting certain positive agenda. It's about repressions against gay people. It's about, you know, repressing contemporary art, promoting the so-called high culture, which is mostly imitation and so on. And of course, yes, constantly arguing with the West about the meaning of democracy, about the meaning of freedoms, human rights, and so on. But not offering anything, you know, any alternative, any meaningful alternative. The only example I can really come up with of some sort of positive agenda that has been proposed was this idea about multi-generation families living together, like in one household, like 3-4 generations living in one apartment, in one house. By people like Mizulina, Elena Mizulina, the Duma deputy, and so on. Well, first of all, it's a caricature. Secondly, it wasn't adopted. It wasn't really, it went nowhere. So the agenda remains repressive. And also, if you look at the language and legitimation patterns that you have there, the Russian elites constantly refer to the West. They have to almost like ask for sanction from the West for whatever they do. Yes, we introduce another repressive law, but it's exactly like, you know, United States Foreign Agents Registration Act, or it's exactly like the German memory laws, or it's exactly like this and this, it's somewhere in Europe or in the West. It's a total normative dependence as well. China opens Confucius institutes. What does Russia open? Institutes, international democracy institutes, right? So they're basically what they're trying to do by deploying people like Migranyan and Narochnitskaya in the West is criticizing the West for not being democratic enough. It's not about projecting Russia's values. It's about simply, you know, mocking the West and trying to to demonstrate that Russia is a better European than anyone else. Why is this a problem, I think? Well, I think, and this is my last point, the problem here is that on the one hand, Russia wants to be an empire. On the other hand, there is nothing, you know, there is an empty spot in the center of this imperial ideology. There is nothing to base this imperial ideology upon. And again, this is a consequence also of peripheral development, because there is the entire economy is dependent on resources. Dependence on Western technologies in some very important sectors, such as telecommunications, is close to 100%. So there is nothing else, you know. There is no, not just nothing else. There is nothing to base this imperial pride on. And whenever this open space suddenly emerges in the debate, this causes a lot of frustration and a lot of anger. And I think, unfortunately, the current rather aggressive foreign policy, I think, can be explained in these terms, or at least understood in this way, as a sort of subaltern imperial frustration of wishing to be independent and powerful, but at the same time seeing that there is nothing to base this power upon, except for maybe military might, but I don't know for how much this can suffice. Okay, I'll stop here, and thank you.
Thank you. I think you were talking a lot about Russia being in the periphery and kind of opposing itself to the core of kind of Europe. I think if you look around the world, there have been very few countries actually having been able to make the transfer from being in the periphery going into the center. And one of the examples, or kind of maybe the only area with some examples, is Asia and Asian countries. So right now, very few people would maybe contest the idea that this century, the economic center point in the world is actually moving towards East Asia. So it is actually possible. So learning from Asian example, could there be a positive scenario for Russia as well?
Well, in principle, yes. I think there is always hope, of course. There can be a definite different scenario based on a different model of development, but for that you need to somehow choose this different model of development. And what we see so far is basically sticking to the same pattern. In the short term, I'm very pessimistic. In the long term, yes, there is always a chance.